Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Maria Antonia Tigre. I'm the Deputy Director of GNHRE, and on behalf of GNHRE and UNEP, I'd like to welcome everyone to this session of our summer winter school. Just a couple of housekeeping things before we start. We are recording this session, so if you don't want to be recorded, just keep your videos off. And we are going to have a breakout session, so we'll stop the recording after these first presentations, and then you can speak freely during the breakout sessions because that part won't be recorded. We also are going to enable captions, so if anyone needs to use that, feel free to do so. Yeah, I think that's it for housekeeping. The last thing is that if you are not a GNHRE member, I'd like you to encourage to apply. You can look it up on our website. But yeah, I'll leave it to you guys to continue for now. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you very much for that. Just hoping, can you see the slides okay on the screen? A thumbs up or a nod. Perfect. Thank you very much. Okay, so hi all, welcome to the Transitioning from the Past through the Present to Potential Futures of Knowledge Hierarchies in Ocean Biodiversity Governance Research panel. My name is Dr. David Wilson. I am a lecturer in history at the University of Strathclyde and co-investigator on One Ocean Hub, where I focus largely on the history and legacies of colonialism within ocean governance. Before delving into the main panel presentations and discussion today, I thought it would be useful just to provide a bit of background to the panel and how it all came about. At present, there is a group of One Ocean Hub researchers, mostly from within the Hub's early career researcher network, who are co-writing a paper titled Reflections on the Past, Present and Potential Futures of Knowledge Hierarchies in Ocean Biodiversity Governance Research. We've been working on this paper for a few months now, which has really provided us with the space to discuss and share our own perspectives and approaches towards knowledge hierarchies. And what we quickly found is that we are all engaging and reflecting on knowledge hierarchies, but are often doing so in quite different ways, and also coming at knowledge hierarchies from quite different perspectives. One reason that this panel came about is that the authors of this paper all come from different disciplinary and institutional backgrounds and are also working within very different contexts. This includes marine scientists, historians, art-based practitioners, anthropologists, lawyers, social scientists, and others. And we're drawn from case studies surrounding children's rights within ocean climate governance, women's knowledge within small-scale fisheries in Ghana, natural capital in the deep sea, the inclusion of dispossessed indigenous groups within ocean biodiversity decision-making in Namibia, and the use of art to challenge knowledge hierarchies in courts and classrooms in South Africa. Across these disciplines and contexts, we are all engaging with and attempting to address or break down knowledge hierarchies, but at the same time, we are often finding it quite difficult to draw a clear narrative from the different ways that we are interrogating and addressing the imbalances created by knowledge hierarchy. Let me just see if I can move this. There we go. Our working definition is that knowledge hierarchies refer to the systematic ordering, ranking, and valuation of knowledge and its production according to the perceived authority, legitimacy, or status of that knowledge within decision-making at different levels. Such knowledge hierarchies and associated processes of knowledge production are steeped within histories of colonization and the parallel development of environmental marine sciences and social sciences, as well as Western-dominated conservationism. This means that such knowledge hierarchies are heavily embedded in the very disciplines that we are trained and working in, whether that's through emphasis on certain types of evidence, on the dominance of concepts of objective knowledge, or even on the very notions of where knowledge is actually produced or generated. This means that as researchers addressing modern ocean biodiversity and conservation challenges, we must not only be aware of the history of knowledge extraction, imposition, and assumptions within our fields, we must also actively work to continuously acknowledge and address these in our work. Yeah, even within research that recognises the need to implement paradigm shifts and transformations, knowledge hierarchies have proven to be multi-layered and perpetuating, even within the context of conscious attempts to address them. Through such methods as the elevation, integration, or bringing together of diverse knowledge systems. Such methods can reproduce knowledge hierarchies, whether through the continued processes of knowledge extraction, or through the methods of weighing up or testing different types of knowledge against each other. These are issues that cannot simply be recognised and addressed, but need constant interrogation and revisiting as research progresses. And so this panel is an opportunity for some of our collaborators to share their perspectives on knowledge hierarchies and how they have been approaching these within their specific research context. But we also want to use this space to engage other perspectives on knowledge hierarchies, to understand how you all who are attending this panel perceive and work through or against or with knowledge hierarchies in your own context and work. So today's panel will proceed as follows, with the programme on the screen at the minute. So after I finish speaking, I'll pass over to our panelists who are going to give short presentations based on their perspectives on knowledge hierarchies in order to prompt some discussion. We'll have a Q&A following all of the presentations. So we'll have all the presentations first, and then we'll have the Q&A after for about 15 minutes or so. And then we will go into breakout groups, really as a chance to start to explore some of the issues that came up in the conversations and some of your own perspectives on knowledge hierarchies as well. Then we'll come back from the breakout groups and have a bit of a discussion on what was covered therein. So I'm going to stop sharing now. There we go. And I'm going to pass over to our first presenter, who is Dr. Holly Nina from the University of Plymouth, who is going to speak on challenging knowledge hierarchies with a natural capital approach. Dr. Holly Nina is a research fellow at the University of Plymouth, and her research focuses on the use and influence of knowledge in decision-making processes in marine contexts. Over to you, Holly. Thanks.
Thanks, David. I'm just sharing my screen. I'll just wait until I think that's ready. Is that okay? Can everyone see my presentation?
Yes.
Yep, lovely. So I'll just launch straight in and try and get this done, because I was setting everyone with a 45-minute presentation, so hopefully we can get it done in 5. Natural capital approaches here. So this is just based on some of the research that we've been doing at the University of Plymouth, based in looking at the deep sea and areas beyond national jurisdiction, which are those regions outside of state sort of control, if you like. So beyond 200 nautical miles. So what are natural capital approaches? So natural capital approaches describe or take account of the ecological system with a lens that tends to include humans as part of that ecological system. It describes the building blocks of the ecosystems, which are the biotic species and habitats, and abiotic rock, oceanic currents, the water column, and sort of focuses them as assets that interact to provide ecosystem services. And ecosystem services are the flows of benefits, such as nutrition obtained from fish stocks, that flow to people and then are experienced by people. These ecosystem services may be converted into benefits by the use of other capitals, including human, financial, or technological capitals, such as the financial backing needed to invest in boats, or technology to catch fish, and then the ports and roads needed to land and realise those economic benefits. But there are also those benefits that flow diffusely to people, that people experience. So that would be climate regulation. So we all experience habitable conditions that allow humanity to thrive. So a natural capital approach marks a change from thinking about ecology in isolation. It enables the entire system and the linkages so intrinsic to human and planetary well-being to be made visible and considered within decision-making. It's also inherently flexible and allows different types of information or knowledge to be included. So, for example, you may not have a quantified way of describing a spiritual connection to nature, but that doesn't make it less valuable or less important to include in decision making. So using such an approach, we advocate, you can consider all these values if that's what you want to do, but it's not without its controversy. And perhaps, well, a lot of my colleagues are probably in this camp in terms of having thoughts about the natural capital approach. So natural capital approaches tend to be driven and have been developed, perhaps those based with an ecological background or have some sort of ecological training. And they've been developed in response to the fact that the value of nature has not traditionally been included within economic budgets and cost-benefit analysis and then decisions around economic trajectories. And this has led to current trends of biodiversity decline, where economic development has been premised on huge degrees of extraction of nature, fish, mined material, for example, the use of the ocean as a receiver and processor of waste. And without the inclusion of this value within these costs when you're making decisions, and an assumption that these benefits are limitless and free, which they aren't. And proponents articulate that the use of a natural capital approach can support a more explicit consideration of the different connections and these values, and therefore has the potential to democratize decision making that implicates biodiversity in some form, as in is making these costs to nature and then people visible, and thus has the potential to challenge knowledge hierarchies. But from other disciplines, there are arguments that a natural capital framing perpetuates a capitalist agenda in framing nature as an asset or having a value, which often gets interpreted as a financial value. And where this does happen, it can be deeply problematic in terms of attempting to understand spiritual and cultural relationships to nature, which can be deeply held with nature understood as inseparable. Not only do the methods commonly employed to integrate these values into frameworks weakly capture what are often rich and complex connections. The methodologies are fairly basic. One example is willingness to pay. I can talk about that in a bit more detail later if people want to talk about that. But they're basically critiqued as making these values, these connections, amenable to exchange. Whereas with many of these relationships are intrinsic, foundational, any assumptions around exchange and fungibility are really very likely to be incorrect and inappropriate. And another critique relates to the detail needed to adequately represent many human nature connections and the associated place-based specificities of these relationships. And that such frameworks are really unlikely to be compatible with presenting or able to include this really rich data. If you think some of these ecosystem services we're talking about affect global society and whether they're actually fit for purpose in terms of integrating those deeply held connections for all of global society. So in summary, and I'm being really brief here, but criticisms broadly relate to a simplification or reduction of nature in order to facilitate transactions through cost-benefit analysis. Such simplification does not just relate to qualitative information or values. It's also inherent to many impact assessment and decision-making tools in marine contexts because of the high uncertainty in knowledge and complexity of environmental functioning within marine environments that operates at virtually all spatial and temporal scales that then give rise to ecosystem services and benefits. Because there is a relative lack of ecological understanding of ecological function and the delivery of ecosystem services, often proxies or indicators for biodiversity are used as a best guess. And while these approaches are considered scientifically acceptable for monitoring change, the use of these proxies is often extended to legitimizing transactions, whereby losses are permitted in exchange for compensation, with either other biodiversity or finance. And generally, such transactions equate to a loss of biodiversity, as these calculations are really unable to account for the complexity and place-based specificity of biotic and abiotic relationships that give rise to biodiversity. So in light of all of this, there is a critique that natural capital approaches are too pragmatic. They do not present a big enough challenge to current modes of capitalist governance. They're sort of feeding a beast, if you like. And because of this, they accept the status quo and do not force the transformational change that's needed for sustainable and equitable ocean governance. So how we think at the University of Plymouth, and maybe I'm sort of reflecting a little bit from my own perspective, is natural capital approaches can challenge these sort of knowledge hierarchies. So our work is focused, as I mentioned, outside 200 nautical miles in the remote ocean. So these regions are characterized by uncertainties. There is very little ecological data available, huge unknowns in how natural capital function in terms of interacts to deliver critical benefits to humans, both diffuse and direct. And here in this image, you can see just a few in which these areas are implicated. And the relative importance of how these different assets or these building blocks of the ecosystems located in these remote oceans act together, and how they control their health or their relative condition controls the delivery or flows of these ecosystem services. And despite the inaccessibility and lack of understanding of these regions, extraction and human pressure is being exerted on the natural capital in these areas through climate change, fishing, shipping, emerging deep sea mining industry. And it's really common with assessments of impact for these potential risks of these activities or pressures in these regions to be viewed as insignificant because they're large spaces, there's not many people there, they're probably in relatively good condition, they don't affect anyone because they're far away. And that's kind of despite overall trends of biodiversity decline globally, and particularly within the ocean. So given that we know that key attributes of marine functioning are premised on a connected medium, so the whole global ocean, some species undertaking huge migrations, global heat transport occurring at a basin scale and beyond, we categorically know that these regions are important in the delivery of ecosystem services, and they're essential for thriving societies and human well-being. And that these regions and natural capital assets need to be accounted for within decision making. So our challenge is, well, what can we do to make these values visible, these connections visible, so that we know potential pressures are significant or pose potential risk? So so these regions are a good example to demonstrate how we believe natural capital approaches can tackle knowledge hierarchies, because there are no relationships that are easily describable or quantified or in statistical terms, and many of the arguably or most important benefits are poorly understood in terms of their ecological controls. So as an example here, we have looked at what information is available in ABNJ to understand particularly the risks to diffuse benefits, so those that global society, or perhaps the most foundational benefits, if you like, coming for global society from these regions. And here the information that perhaps we do have, you can see in black, and that in grey is what we don't have. But given that for many of so we don't have much of the information, yet what we do know is that these benefit flows do exist, and broadly what they look like. Similarly, we know what pressures are occurring via human activities, and again, we know broadly what sort of assets, and in some cases which specific assets, these are acting on, and we know for certain what the controls on these pressures look like. So in compiling all of this information, ranging from descriptive to highly uncertain, we can paint a picture of the system and identify key areas of risk as identified by gaps or ineffective governance. So basically connections between the human pressures all the way through to the benefit flows that people are experiencing without the specific information in the middle. So this example shows the flexibility of a natural capital approach to include all types of information, and therefore challenge assertions that the only information that can legitimately be included in economic decision making is that which is statistically certain, and that statistical certainty is the only driver of action to avert biodiversity degradation. So that was a really whistle-stop tour, but that's why I think natural capital approaches can be useful and can challenge knowledge hierarchies. Anyway, let me stop sharing so we can move on to the next presentation.
Thank you so much, Holly. That was really interesting. I'm sure there'll be lots of
Have I
questions.
stopped sharing?
Yeah, you've stopped sharing. Don't worry, you have stopped sharing. All good. As I said in the chat as well, please do introduce yourself in the chat if you want to, and we'll also have the Q&A at the end of presentations, but you can add questions in the chat while the presentations are ongoing, and we'll try to pick them up at the end as well. So our second presentation comes from Marley Mudeni Samuel, who is a PhD candidate at the Glasgow School of Art in the School of Simulation and Visualization. Her research revolves around digital ocean heritage and the intricate dynamics of ocean knowledge, culture, and relationships, while also exploring equitable access to ocean information and digital technologies. She is currently interested in digital transformation, digital heritage, innovation, and extended reality to facilitate access and the preservation of knowledge and cultural heritage. And Marley's presentation is titled Ocean and Coastal Communities, Imperative of Indigenous and Experiential Knowledge. Over to you, Marley. Thanks.
Thank you so much, David. Can you all see my presentation fine?
Yep, it's all there fine.
Awesome. So as David mentioned, my name is Marley Mudeni Samuel, and I'm a PhD candidate with the Glasgow School of Art. My research focuses on ocean digital heritage, but today I'm going to be talking about ocean and coastal communities, focusing on the imperative of Indigenous and experiential knowledge. So for a brief overview, okay. So for a brief overview, I'm going to be focusing on my research context, which is in Namibia, followed by coastal communities and the intense relationships that they have with the ocean, and then the challenges that they also face. And then I'll be talking about the relevance of Indigenous and experiential knowledge. And then lastly, the role of technology when it comes to knowledge preservation. So my research is focused in Namibia, a southwestern African country that is bordering South Africa and Angola. And my research works with coastal communities in Wafish Bay and Swakopmund, who usually have long-standing knowledge and often unique relationships with the ocean, which they depend on for their livelihoods, cultural practice, and identities. So my research aims to then surface the ocean knowledge, cultural practices, and the relationships that the coastal communities have with the ocean, while also examining how technology then can support state coastal communities in documenting or recording their ocean knowledge, their culture and relationships for posterity, preservation, and to improve ocean conservation. Now, a little bit about ocean relationships. So many coastal communities have deep-rooted relationships and connections with the ocean, which are referred to as ocean relationalities. And they can be cultural, spiritual, medical, physical, emotional, mental, but most importantly, for economic sustenance. Holly previously also kind of spoke about them. Now I'm going to give 3 examples of communities out there in the world that rely on the ocean very much, which kind of speaks to their deep-rooted relationships with the ocean. Firstly, it's the seashell collectors found in Namibia, who engage in the practice of collecting seashells by the beach shores, which they use to create cultural and traditional jewelry. Some of them also use it for contemporary jewelry, but mostly for the traditional ones, which are very important to one of the tribes in Namibia, which is the Awambo tribe. And they go through a rigorous process to create these cultural jewelry. So as you can see in this picture, the woman is kind of holding them up after a whole process of grinding them, kind of putting holes in the seashells, putting them on like wire, like wires, as you can see then, and then transferring them onto a thread for them to kind of make the traditional jewelry that I'm speaking about. Then secondly, we have the female armor divers of Japan. They can also be found in Korea, and they dive for seafood not using traditional diving equipment, mostly just relying on traditional techniques for them to techniques and knowledge for them to kind of then get the seafood and the ocean resources that they rely on and they kind of depend on for their livelihoods. And then lastly, we have the Ghanaian fisher folk, who use a variety of traditional fishing methods, including wooden canoes, which they sometimes make themselves, and nets to harvest fish from the ocean. Now, all these communities have one thing in common. They all rely on indigenous and experiential as well as traditional techniques and knowledge for them to kind of practice these activities that feed back into their livelihoods. And this knowledge has been passed down through generations, and this is the knowledge that they still then practice. It kind of circles back to their deep, intricate relationships with the ocean. Similarly, these coastal communities face numerous imbalances, impositions, and challenges relating to the ocean. I'm just going to be mentioning two of them for now. The first one being a lack of representation in decision making. So a lot of decisions are being made about ocean resources and conservation without meaningful impact from the coastal communities, which results in the implementation of policies that do not align with the needs and priorities of these communities. And then secondly, there's also challenges of loss of livelihoods. That is due to challenges such as overfishing, pollution, the exploitation of ocean resources, and climate change, which is the big bang of it all, which then has diverse effects on the ocean's ecosystem. And then in turn, it also affects the livelihoods of the coastal communities because they rely heavily on the ocean activities, ocean resources, and other things that have to do with the ocean. However, regardless of these challenges, some of these coastal communities have always found a way to kind of adapt to these environmental changes, which kind of speaks to their resilience, and it also speaks to the knowledge that they have, that they have gained or that they have acquired through generations or just through experience. Now, the relevance of indigenous and experienced knowledge. So throughout my research, I've been working with communities in Namibia, as I said, and the community members themselves speak about, or the participants that I've been working about, that they kind of emphasize the importance of indigenous and experiential knowledge, because some of them say they still practice or use the knowledge that they've gained from their parents and their grandparents, or the parents from their grandparents and so forth. So it's a whole chain of knowledge that has been passed down. It kind of fits back into this whole practice. For example, in the Oshuambo culture, like I said, they make the jewelry, as you can see in the picture, that is made out of seashells, which is very important to the Oshuambo culture because it kind of links to many cultural customs and practices that are of great significance. So one of the participants from this tribe then said that the ocean provides for us traditionally and spiritually, provides for us seashells that are important for us because they protect us from bad spirits. So we usually collect them, put them in containers in our rooms as a form of protection. And this kind of relationship speaks to a spiritual relationship connected to the ocean. Whereas one of the other participants from the Tokna community, which is a marginalized community in Namibia. So they previously inhabited the seashores of Namibia, but over the years, and due to colonialism, they moved inland of Namibia. But their core practices many years ago kind of linked back to the ocean because fishing and other ocean activities were part of their daily activities and livelihood. So he says that although we are no longer in close proximity to the ocean, there are customs that we still practice to honor and appreciate our ancestors and reaffirm ourselves that we do really come from the ocean. So this kind of speaks to why the ocean is really important to these coastal communities, and that it holds cultural and spiritual significances for them. And that is also why the knowledge they have, or let's say indigenous, experiential, traditional, and technical knowledge that is being gained and passed on is important, because it has the capability to help contribute to sustainable ocean resource management, to help combat climate change, to foster climate resilience. If you look at how they've kind of adapted to ways in climate change, but also for ocean conservation. And then lastly, through collaborative methods, working with these communities, the knowledge that can be gained from them can also inform policies and decision making. Now, just to talk a little bit about knowledge sharing and dissemination, and then the role that technology kind of plays in this regard. Lu et al. Explains that technology has always played a part in supporting proactive endeavors that safeguard and protect tangible and intangible cultural heritage. So the same can be said that technology can also then play that role when it comes to ocean knowledge, cultural relationships, or just anything that has to do with the ocean and how it can kind of be documented or preserved. So during the research that I've been doing, I kind of conducted participatory design and community-based co-design workshops over a period of 4 months, and I had 12 workshops altogether. Now, through these workshops, we now talked about the ocean and how it kind of relates to the coastal communities, why it's important, but then we also talked about how then the knowledge that they have about the ocean in regarding its benefits and what other people can learn from it, how then it can be documented. And so we explored augmented reality and how then it can be used to record, say, the existing culture, ocean cultural knowledge, and also to reveal other intricate relationships that these coastal community members have with the ocean. And so from that, we co-produce an augmented reality application called Efutaletu Sudahurib, which means our ocean in 2 native languages in Namibia, Oshwambo and Kwekegova. And the title kind of speaks back to, when the participants were kind of explaining it, they said it speaks back to their uniqueness as well, and also kind of their grounding as Namibians, but also speaks back to the ocean. It also kind of suggests that technology has then the power to help share, to give access, to kind of help with education and also advocacy. And it kind of came out through the workshops as well, because the participants were like, this application can then really work in a sense that other people who do not have access to the ocean or know much about it, they can learn about it through the app, or they can kind of have access to the ocean through this information if they do not have access to it, depending on where they kind of reside. So just to kind of finalize and finish off, through numerous research, it's kind of been found that the utilization of participatory and collaborative approaches can be very enlightening. And that's why researchers and institutions should kind of embrace transdisciplinary research and collaborative participatory initiatives that incorporate knowledge of all domains in order to create sustainable interventions and inclusive ocean solutions. Because the ocean is very important to most of these coastal communities. It doesn't just represent like a body of water for them. It represents lived realities, identities, relationships that encompass life, spirituality, mystery, healing, sustenance, a sense of place for them, but importantly, a future for humanity. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Mara. That was fascinating. I'm sure there'll be lots of questions as well to come. We're going to move on to our third presentation now. This comes from Dr. Alana Lancaster, who is a lecturer in international environmental and energy law and is the head of the recently formed Environmental Law, Ocean Governance and Climate Justice Unit of the Faculty of Law at the University of the West Indies. And Alana is going to present on contemporary knowledge hierarchies, colonialism and conservation. Thank you. Over to you, Alana.
Thank you, David. There we go. Sorry, here you see my screen.
Yep, all good.
Yes. Thank you, everyone. And it's such a pleasure to be on such a wonderful panel and to continue the conversations that we have in preparing this really important paper. If I could only get my slides. Okay. So as we lead in the forthcoming paper, we highlight that governance on the ocean and its biodiversity are deeply entangled in not only the histories of colonialism, but also parallel developments in environmental, marine, and social science, as well as law and Western-centric conservatism. In many respects, the law has been an instrument that has provided legitimacy to these not the knowledge hierarchies that would have been imposed at the time of colonialism, most notably concepts such as the doctrine of discovery and terra nullius, which have largely been used to justify not only the expansion of Western civilizations, but also to marginalize indigenous peoples and subsequently traditional peoples and their knowledge. Because of the expansion of some of these constructs, we have seen a historic, political, as well as systemic bias across research systems and governance, as well as conservation approaches that do not take into consideration non-Western approaches. Nevertheless, and while many of these processes are aimed at addressing many of the challenges we find, many of the contemporary planetary threats of the Anthropocene continue, and there's growing impatience with the status quo. And as a result, there are clear expressions that the law needs to facilitate a transition from past approaches to facilitate more inclusive and mutually respect knowledge hierarchies, which mutually respect knowledge co-production or co-production, or even recognize existing knowledge systems. And so an example of that, without getting overly legal, would be the events which are underway in this week and next in Hamburg, for example, where there are hearings in which is what is considered a very landmark action in regard to climate justice and the ocean, but I can get into that, a discussion of that later or in the questions. So we've seen, in the Anthropocene, we've seen the deepening of three, in some respects, the three horsemen of the apocalypse: climate change, pollution, and biodiversity loss. And all three of these exert tremendous pressure on ocean ecosystems and their biodiversity, and consequently, as Marley and Holly would have highlighted, because of the didactic feedback loops, they exert pressure on those persons who most rely on them. So there's urgent need to find solutions which counter these threats to both oceans and their biodiversity, as well as to meet the needs of human societies. And overwhelmingly, Western approaches have focused on expanding scientific knowledge in various fields. I've listed a few there. However, it is clear that despite these innovations and advancements, the triple planetary crisis looms larger than ever. So there is need to interrogate, and this has long been the assertion of 12 scholars, so scholars of international law who have championed third world and even fourth world approaches to international, the approach international law takes. That is an approach that moves away from the constructs such as the doctrine of discovery and terra nullius, and those are just about two. And the reason I highlighted those two is because of their direct link to both the management of ocean spaces and their resources. There's been calls also from anthropologists to dismantle systems which mask the legitimization of the status quo. Now, so therefore, addressing the root causes of these crises requires transitions and transformative approaches. And I should add, many of these approaches need to be grounded in interdisciplinarity. And Holly alluded to this in her presentation, because in many respects, many disciplines, anthropologists, lawyers, marine scientists, historians, and so on have been coming at, there's been the recognition that we tend to be in our silos. And I think this is one of the strengths of the space we have been allowed under the One Ocean Hub as early career researchers, or early-ish career researchers, to be exposed, and this is what makes our discussions, and indeed what the discussion that will follow shortly, so rich. So there are many illustrations of how these hierarchies need to be dismantled, and indeed, as I say, there are several examples of international or groups of persons who might have been marginalized, and there are groups at many levels, from the level of states to the grassroots level, so to peoples and communities such as indigenous peoples, women, children, and so on. Now, the challenge is that many of these systems have endured through events, historic events, such as the annihilation of indigenous peoples, slavery, indentureship, assimilation. And also, it is important to note that even as nationhood, or the many nations became independent and began to build their nations, that sorry, that dispossession and marginalization still occurred. So as I think slowly what we have seen at the multilateral environment, at the multilateral level, is that there needs to be a mobilization of multiple and established knowledge systems, values, and governance systems to adequately address these challenges that are either complementary to or superior in many respects to Western approaches, because we often, again, because of historical and other reasons, think that Western approaches are superior. And as someone who, my background before becoming a lawyer was a scientist, you're told that science, once you can prove something in science, it's immutable. But I think when we interrogate many indigenous knowledge systems, we may not view them as scientific from a Western perspective, but indeed they have sound bases. And it's just a how we view, or the perspective we view. So a strengthened what they call it, link or a nexus between indigenous knowledge holders and the science. So, for example, we're in a decade of ocean science, would be required and critical to the success of this decade of ocean science will be to incorporate indigenous knowledge holders based on decolonized knowledge co-production. And the concept of co-production, as coined by Ostrom, was really conceptualized within the construct of common pool resources such as oceans, in which communities and stakeholders can participate and contribute to robust governance structures, such as those at the ocean climate nexus, as well as the ocean development and cultural nexus. And as I will highlight shortly, that if my slide would move forward, there have been increased recognition, not only in instruments. So I look at how these three key instruments, which are critical to ocean governance, have moved progressively to incorporate elements of traditional and local knowledge systems as part of their approaches. And I will identify some advances in quasi and judicial processes shortly. So the Convention on Biodiversity is perhaps the main instrument which endorses this approach among the multilateral environmental agreements. And this is supported by the UN GNHRE, the adoption of the UN Declaration on Indigenous Peoples, and further consolidated by the work of the Intergovernmental Working Group on biological EBS, sorry, I sometimes forget the acronyms, as well as the recent Kunming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework and the Nagoya Protocol, which while states have been sluggish to accede to this, the fundamental underpinning of this agreement is access and benefit sharing and equity. The recently concluded BBNJ agreement is also which I think while it could have perhaps gone further, it is very heartening to see that that Indigenous peoples and local communities have been incorporated across the text. And it opens the door for human rights approaches, as I will explain shortly. Also, the provision for the strategic environmental assessment on the BBNJ agreement also addresses equity issues and incorporates human rights. And finally, the Paris Agreement, as well as the UNFCCC, have to some increasing extent. So we have Article 3, as well as Articles 9 and 7, Article 3 of the Climate Change Convention, Articles 9 and 7 of the Paris Agreement. It remains to be seen whether Article 8 on loss and damage, in light of the decision at COP27 to establish the loss and damage fund, will also provide this avenue. I am cautiously optimistic while being a bit skeptical. The Paris Agreement of itself has a sparse recognition of Indigenous, and I put in brackets perhaps local peoples, but traditional environmental knowledge has been increasingly referenced by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and there are more robust provisions for agency in the Sharm el-Sheikh implementation plan, as supported by the adoption of General Comment 26. So in wrapping up in regard to human rights, what I want to say is that increasingly the traditional knowledge and incorporating traditional knowledge into our ocean science and decision making and governance has been embraced by the intergovernmental panels of both the Convention on Biological Diversity as well as Convention on Climate Change. And this is bookended by many legal instruments and the decisions of treaty bodies and judicial and quasi-judicial bodies. And I give some examples there, the judgments, the landmark judgments of the Human Rights Council in Toyota and the Torres Islanders, and the trilogy of climate justice hearings, both in front international courts, so that would be the trilogy of advisory opinions. And then we also have a trilogy of cases in front of the European Court, which are also important. And I view as very important the expansion of Rio Principle 10 on the instruments such as the Escazú Agreement for the Latin American Caribbean region, the Aarhus Convention for the European region. And even though it's a non-binding instrument, the UN guiding principles on business and human rights has infiltrated both into agreements such as the Aarhus Convention, but also the recent due diligence legislation by the European Union. So what I will conclude, is I think I'm over my time, is that much of the expansion that has occurred in pushing the inclusion of traditional knowledge. So for example, in the Torres Islander case, it was stressed that culture, the impact on culture, and that subsequent impact on intergenerational equity by not robust climate change measures was against the human rights of the Torres Islanders. So much of this expansion has occurred under international human rights law or national mechanisms which adopt a right-based approach than any other normative approach. And I end by saying that if we assess many of traditional and local knowledge systems, that these systems are underpinned by principles of equity and social equity and fairness, and therefore we need to transition and transform our knowledge hierarchies in line with this. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Alana. That was excellent. And I think we'll have lots of questions as well. So I'm going to just open the floor to questions right away. Please do raise your hand. You can ask the question live if you want to, or you can raise your hand just on the screen. I'll try and catch you that way. Or indeed, if you want rather ask your question via the chat, you can do so as well. So yeah, any questions? Just get the screen up so I can see it. While you're kind of thinking about questions and maybe write them in the chat, I'll take the chair's prerogative and I'll just ask the first question. So I'm wondering, across all the presentations, there was discussion of participatory approaches or the sort of integration of knowledge. And I just wanted to ask a bit more about your own perspectives on participatory approaches and what approaches you've used in your research to engage with different types of knowledge and different perspectives on the issues you work on, and then the challenges you faced in this as well. So I think it's always useful just to hear about the challenges as well as the successes in this. Who wants to go first?
I guess I should go. I can go first because I guess from the outset I should say that law perhaps is not the most participatory, the discipline that is participatorily based. We do a lot of, I suppose, normative work and drafting and so on. And one of my criticisms usually, because as I said, I come from a science and then I came into law, is that we usually lawmaking is done, or in the past at least, lawmaking was done from a very top-down approach, and to some extent still is. So participation and consultation were not usually the watchwords. Happily, we have in various ways at the national level. The main one is the environmental impact assessment, which is the one, and also the strategic environmental assessment, which are the ones I'm more familiar with. But increasingly, we also have seen the explosion of approaches such as marine spatial planning and so on, which by their very nature require more participation and consultation. But I will say that the challenge is meaningful participation and consultation, as opposed to consultation and participation, which checks boxes and so on. And that is area which definitely needs to be developed more, because I think from a legal background, persons think that it's the role of law is, to govern and introduce order, and it's kind of like pushing back against a system to introduce more participation. So.
Excellent, thank you, Alana. Marley, would you like to come in? I see your camera came on, please.
So I think some of the challenges, because the research that I do is heavily grounded in participatory and collaborative work. But some of the challenges that I've experienced, because I also kind of take the technical approach. So my PhD is kind of rooted in the oceans, but it's also rooted in technology and how technology can then preserve ocean knowledge. So in that instance, because I worked with coastal communities, one of the challenges was the engagement with the technologies, because for most of them, say 60% of them, they've never actually used augmented reality or virtual reality or engaged with some of the technologies that we explored. However, because my research kind of also adapted like a rapid ethnography approach, and I had workshops over a long period of time, 12 workshops to be exact. I kind of had time to work with these technologies. So some of these challenges were kind of alleviated in a sense. I can't say that, oh, okay, now they are digital literate, all of them, but all I can say is that they did learn a few things about technology, on how to use it, why it's important, and also how it can be used to kind of create awareness about things, because we co-produce this augmented reality application together, which kind of embedded their knowledge, and they came up with all that knowledge. So just a little bit about the application. So it kind of holds, so what we did is we sat down and we talked about the ocean, and then we kind of wanted to know how the ocean connects back to the participants. So they brought objects that relate or kind of represent their ocean significance, and those objects were turned into 3D models that were then put in the augmented reality app. And then they kind of wrote stories about those objects, and if someone kind of goes through it, they then just kind of narrate and go through the application in that sort. So they kind of had time through that process to learn about it. Another challenge at the beginning was more of the language barrier, not from my point of view, because I speak 2 languages from Namibia, one fluently and the other kind of moderate. But for the participants themselves to kind of express themselves in English, but the platform was available for them to express themselves in whatever language they wanted. But because of the collaborative methods that we used, and because the co-participants themselves were already invigorated in that method, they themselves helped through the process. So the research also became a part of them. So whenever someone was struggling, one of the co-participants would be like, oh no, I'm going to sit next to, say, Memathe, and I'm going to kind of translate for her. I'm going to help her so she can understand what we're doing. So yeah, some of these challenges kind of did surface, but we kind of came up with solutions on how to tackle them.
Amazing. Thank you, Marla. That's great. And yeah, I just think that longer term process that you're speaking on, the actual time investment within building that relationship and also working through different workshops is just so important. And it speaks to that point about meaningful consultation that Kathleen's put in the chat, and I'll read it out if anyone would like to come in on this question. But what does the panel think are the main barriers to real meaningful consultation and engagement of coastal communities and other marginalised groups more generally? Anyone would like to come in on that? Alana, I think you just answered in the chat, but you can read it out if you'd like.
No, I give a very law-like approach. No, I remember reading this article a few years ago, and it was in regard to fisher folks and their perspectives on and their perspective on a consultation process. And one of the statements of one of them stuck with me, because basically he or she said that yes, they were invited to the table to have a discussion, but it was like being at a table with and a meal is being served, but they didn't have cutlery to eat it with. And I think that in many, and again, as I said, in the chat, my response is looking at it from I suppose a legal approach, is that in many respects, one of the key areas is to enhance access, right? So access to information, access to justice. And because a lot of the issues we're speaking about, it shouldn't be remediatory justice, but the ability to be involved in processes before, as well as to stop processes that are not wholesome or can be destructive. And I really do think that, so in the Caribbean region, certainly we've incorporated many what are supposedly participatory approaches by means of passing legislation that provide for EIAs. But there are many, so that's there. The relevant agency may undertake that work, but or the procedure, but the reality. So many things, for example, as Marley referenced, language, literacy levels, simple things like, persons are out about the business of making a living. So these can act as barriers, but certainly under the English legal system, once the authority can say, we tick these boxes, it's difficult to challenge a decision. Even if it's prejudicial to traditional and local communities and indigenous communities. So that's my very lawyer-like response. And I'm sure it's much wider than that, I could tell you.
Thank you, and I think that it's so important, just especially the point that you made about what participation means from the offset, especially. So it's not participation at a certain point, it's participation throughout a process, and just designing what participation actually means, rather than bringing in people to participate at the point where they have to, almost through legal obligations. And I think that speaks to Marley's point about, again, co-designing the app, but also co-designing the app over a long-term period, and actually working with people to feel that empowerment through doing, basically, and through participation as well. But yeah, I think we could talk here about co-production and participation, and the sort of different ways that occurs in practice, often not what we would like to see. I'm going to ask a couple more questions that are coming into the chat. Elaine says thanks for the speakers, and has a question for Nina and Marley. So we'll go to Nina first, if that's okay.
I think that's me.
I was saying Nina, but yes.
Yeah, that's okay. It often happens. It's funny.
Sorry, I'm getting mixed up with Nina. Sorry.
No, people do. They always do that with my surname. I often get called Nina. So I guess your question relates to whether natural capital and social capital approaches can fit together and how that might happen. And I think they definitely can, but I think both approaches aren't set in stone in terms of what they look like. But I think a particular way that they could usefully integrate or sort of overlap and inform against each other to sort of link that bigger picture of the human nature system, if you like, would be to consider how social capacity or social capital and the processes that allow that. So, for example, like through co-production, things like these, and how policies that feed into that to support it, policies and projects and activities, I suppose, enable or maintain the flow of benefits between nature and people. So where you've got, I don't know whether I'm perhaps not speaking particularly clearly, but what I mean is when you think about the system, and I spoke about the additional capital, so where you've got technological, financial, or human capital, then that's probably where social capital would come in, and approaches for co-production. And then that would also feed into sort of the controls and governance that you've got around it that allows or enables people to have a say in how pressures or degradation or extraction of natural capital may be undertaken. Yeah, if that makes sense. But really, that it's very flexible. So it's the sort of thing that can take whatever form you like. I think the important thing for me is that the idea is to make people's the connections with people explicit, and the values that people hold explicit, even if they're not quantifiable or statistical, which is generally what a lot of decision making is set up to sort of fit in with.
Thank you, Holly. And Marley, has a question for you also. is there a hope that decision makers can engage with the app? Yes, what's sort of vision for that?
Yeah, thank you, Lynn, for that question. And it's a very important question. So there is hope for decision makers to engage with the app. But the question is, will they actually want to integrate the knowledge that is then embedded on it into the decisions that they are making? I remember for one of the workshops, we had like a demonstration workshop where we were kind of showing the application to a number of people within those coastal communities. And one of the institutions we went to was the municipality in Swakopmund, and we were kindly turned down. So they didn't really go through the app. They were just like, oh, maybe if you guys are going to show it somewhere else, then you can bring it then, but we do not have time. So instances like that do happen. However, for the community, what was very important for them was that other people in the coastal towns to learn about the ocean and the benefits that it can kind of attain for them, like how it has kind of improved their livelihoods or their well-being for the now coastal communities that I worked with. Because one of the coastal communities who works with seaweed, and she kind of takes seaweed extract to use in her garden. She was like, this is like valuable knowledge, and people can actually use this to also create their gardens. And those who are maybe having problems with buying vegetables and other stuff, they can just create their gardens. And this is what I want people to know. They kind of want other coastal community members to learn from it. However, we're still in works to disseminate or to demonstrate their application to a greater audience than that is of the communities that we engaged with.
Excellent, thank you, Marley. And we have another final question in the chat here from Rembrandt, and it's kind of the million-dollar question that we've been engaging with on the paper we've been writing. That's probably why it's taken so long to write. Is the idea of hierarchies of knowledge an existing legal concept? As I am not a lawyer, I wonder about that. And then goes on to say, I know many practices have been introduced in this session, but are there, let's call them legal successes to report based on the concept of hierarchies of knowledge? Maybe this is what everyone is talking about, but I would be interested to understand the practicalities of this concept of hierarchies of knowledge, philosophical or social. I understand and subscribe to the concept, but I'm not clear yet how it works legally. Who would like to take that one?
I'm not sure even if I want to take that one, but so in response to the first question, I did put I guess an analogy in the chat, which I'm definitely trying to find now, because I think the question was along the line of whether there are hierarchies in law or something along that line. But and my response was, law by its very nature is hierarchical. So I'm from the English legal system, and it's a tiered structure. But more importantly, I use the analogy of how equity entered the English legal system. One of the reasons for equity and the equity entering the English legal system was because there was a large scale marginalization of a majority of the population who were not noble, because in those days, if you couldn't read, I believe it was Latin, most of the judgments were in Latin, and so on and so forth. No need to give a history lesson, but essentially this marginalized a large percentage of the population and who could not access justice. And equity was introduced as a way to expand the access to justice and create fairer conditions. And I think in many respects we are at that point in international law. In many respects, some of which I mentioned in the presentation, because I think those who are marginalized, and I shouldn't only say at international law, but in where persons are being marginalized and impacted, they have grown impatient. With respect to whether they're successes, I would say that we have the ingredients and they have been small victories, but these victories, such as the pronouncements, for example, in the Torres Islanders case, and I do think the incorporation, for example, of in the final document of indigenous and local communities into the BBNJ instrument, as well as moderately robust provisions for strategic environmental assessment are causes for optimism, because they open the door to, as I said, human rights approaches, which is the area which I think 10, 15 years, or maybe even 5 years ago, I think this was the area that no one expected to explode like this, and certainly has been the basis of much more optimism and concrete action than international environmental or trade law or other areas of law, who are now being called to task, or even law of the sea. So the hearing these 2 weeks in Hamburg is more than likely going to define the relationship with law of the sea that law of the sea has in respect to climate change, and how knowledge systems flow between the global north and global south. So maybe not a yes or no answer, but it's a complex issue, and because of the historical it's embedded under history and politics, it's going to take a while to dismantle, I think.
Thanks, Alana. That's great. And yeah, I think just to give some context, we kind of came into the idea of knowledge hierarchies just based on different perspectives, because we were all engaging with ideas like participatory research or integrating different knowledge systems. And so the idea of knowledge hierarchies just kind of came out of there, as used in some literature, but it actually has been a bit of a trouble to find, a body of literature that all engages with knowledge hierarchies as we are referring to them. Which was kind of my fault for just putting that in the title. But hey, it's part of the fun of it. But to be honest, it mostly comes from, at least from the perspective that we've been talking about it, as Alana mentioned, it's more from context of decolonial research, especially really looking at the dominance of certain knowledge systems through colonial processes that have become embedded in things like law and governance and science, as a sort of dominant science throughout the globe, and how that's undermined or suppressed or neglected other forms of knowledge and created this hierarchy that exists in these frameworks as well. So that's where we're engaging with it. But yeah, there's other knowledge hierarchies. When you Google knowledge hierarchies, other things will come up, and other sort of research will come up as well. But for the most part, we've been engaging in it from that perspective. Hopefully our paper will address that and sort of explain that as well. Excellent. Well, Lisa, did I see your hand was up? Yeah, there you are.
Yeah, hello everyone, and thanks David, and thanks to all of you for this fascinating panel. As you know, I'm a big fan, and I love to know what everybody's doing in the world of knowledge hierarchies. And I'm going to start with a daunting. This is more of a comment than a question, but it's actually really what really fascinated me, because I had the pleasure to be on the previous panel organized by One Ocean Hub about the gender, and I just wanted because there are a couple of people, I can see the names and the faces that were on both panels, but I don't think all of us were, obviously. And I just want to convey that there was a couple of really mirror messages across these two panels. And one of them is this anecdote that you, Alana, told us about the fisherfolk community member who said, okay, you gave us the access to the table, but you didn't give us the cutlery to enjoy the meal. And someone, more than one person actually at the gender panel raised the notion of to have a right officially on the paper and to be allowed let or enable to exercise that right is not one and the same, and they're often in the everyday world really different things. So I would like to, pun very much intended, to connect with Holly's topic, to capitalize on the diversity of the disciplines that we have at the table today, and to just ask all of you if you can comment on how much does that cut through all of the disciplines and all of your work. How much does this notion of, because this is something that I really, really super often hear across our disciplines when it comes to ocean and ocean governance and ocean health and climate change and ocean climate nexus, is this notion problem issue of access. So can you comment on access, very broadly defined, from your contexts?
Thanks, Billy. It's a good question. Who would like to take that? Perfect. Molly, Alana, Holly, would anyone like to come in?
I have to apologise that I was I'm struggling. Can you just reiterate? So the issue was access and
So
in relation to, I'm trying
yeah.
to think in relation to what I'm doing around. Can you just like summarize a minute?
Yeah, totally. Yes, it is. Sorry, I got a little bit carried away. Sorry. It's basically the notion of access is something that I really often hear across disciplines who deal with or scholars who deal with either the law or the social sciences and all of the other sort of, hello. Hi.
Sorry.
Yeah, so yeah, the notion of access is something that I think cuts across everybody's work across the hub when we talk about One Ocean Hub and about ocean climate nexus, rights of child, rights of women and girls, and other topics that we tackle in the ocean context. And it sort of boils down to this notion of access. So the access to the decision-making table, the access to the actual sort of equitable or equal knowledge co-production, where like the decision of what's scientific is in certain hands, and sort of like just so like being granted access on paper to different communities, to different knowledge holders, to different stakeholders. How equitable, how equal, how inequitable, how does this notion of access to the decision-making table, to the knowledge, to the actual coast, to the ocean, to the heritage database, how does that come up in your research, if anyway? I hope that made slightly more sense.
No, it does. It's just very difficult to answer in the context of the global ocean, because and I think that's the problem, isn't it? Is you've got this part, it's really integral part of the planet that delivers all of these things that are so important for global society, yet people feel like they're very removed from it because I suppose in a way the information and the way, this is exactly what we speak about when we talk about knowledge hierarchies, is the data that's valued is largely inaccessible to the lay person, not only because these connections aren't drawn between how the ecology or these regions might be important to them or to us, but also because the people aren't deemed to be stakeholders, and so you're not provided access to the table because there are no mechanisms for consultation. Because how do you consult global society? We don't know how to do that. So it's yeah, it's
Thanks, Holly.
Well,
Alana,
a future scientist or knowledge hierarchy. Absolutely adorable. I just my comment, and it may provoke some more thought, is that knowledge and information is absolutely a tool of power and control. And I think if we look historically, not granting access to information or even access to protect your rights was a mechanism of control. And if we want to look at it in contemporary times, and this is what 12 scholars, for example, argue the imbalances between the global north and global south do now translate it further into imbalances. So, for example, quite apart from investment in technology and so going forward, there are a lot of information held in archives in the global north. So, for example, if I want to research on my country or in perhaps most of the Caribbean region, there's more sitting in London or Amsterdam than there is sitting in the Caribbean. And part of that is because we've done a horrible job at preserving what we have. Yes, I can see that, but also accessing this information is part of the challenge. There's also the challenge which Marley's project touches on, technology. And so, for example, both the Convention on Biological Diversity and the Convention on the Paris Agreement touch on this, as well as the Parent Treaty, transfer of technology from more developed to less developed countries. Now, within the context of the Climate Change Convention, this is more and more, this is getting more and more complex because it's not a black and white issue, which is, and those of you who might be keeping in will recognize that the BRICS group, which was initially within the Climate Change Convention, the group that was neither fish nor fowl, is rapidly expanding, and that will have implications for many areas of not only knowledge hierarchies, but the access of decision making, world economics and finance. So those are just my thoughts. Sorry.
No, that's great.
great.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, Alana. Marley, do you have any thoughts on this as well? Want to make sure you've got time to come in.
There was just a question that I really wanted to answer from Kathleen.
Oh yeah, please, I wanted to ask you that one for you. Please.
Okay, cool. But regarding what Melita kind of talked about access, it's a very important point because, like you said, access is kind of a universal thing. And then in my perspective, when it comes to technology, like Alana said, it's already a big challenge on its own. Maybe not so much here in the global north, but in the global south, technology infrastructure is not easily accessible as it is in other parts of the world. And I guess that's why when we worked on the research that we're working on, some of the participants were like, maybe they were like, okay, we don't really know how to use this, but we've seen, because we went through an exploration phase where they kind of went through a variety of other technologies that kind of preserved and documented knowledge that's been kind of used in other countries. And they were like, maybe the same way that it's been done in other countries, it can be done here, and other people can kind of learn about all of these ocean benefits through this technology. However, with that said, the technology itself is kind of decolonizing in a sense that not everyone can kind of have access to it because it's not supported on all kinds of mobile phones. And these are just kind of the accessible challenges that are kind of related to technology, all in all. With it being said that all of these companies that kind of govern the policies, technological policies, don't make it possible for some phones to have functionalities that support a few applications and only other phones, and mostly those are the high-end phones, like the expensive phones, which not too many people can afford. So it's definitely something that needs to be looked at. And I think that it's honestly going to take a whole long time for that gap to be breached. But then going back to Kathleen's question on distrust, so I actually did not encounter this with the communities that I've worked with, because I'm primarily interested in participatory work, and the work that we do is always over a period of time. And what happens is that you kind of build a relationship and trust with those communities. So they really put themselves into the research. And it's not just for the research, because for some of them, they're like, it's a platform for us to gain knowledge, and it's also a platform for us to teach. And that's now the researchers that are being taught. However, it did come up in some of the workshops that we're having with the participants, that they've attended a few other workshops and seminars, but the challenge they have is that the researchers or institutions, they just come in for that one day. It's a whole day workshop, then they talk and ask questions, get answers, and then they are gone. Then they maybe see them again 2 years later, and they kind of feel like they're being exploited. They kind of feel like, okay, maybe the knowledge is going somewhere and being implemented somewhere, but we don't know that. We don't see any product. We don't see any results. So yeah, those are the challenges that kind of also need to be looked at.
Thank you.
Thanks, Marley. And yeah, just wanted to kind of pick up on that point as well about access, and just thinking about when we talk about access, how we also need to think about who has the resources to access knowledge and how is it used. Because knowledge was always co-produced during the colonial period. I mean, it was always co-produced knowledge, but who actually received credit, recognition of global audiences for that knowledge were Europeans and Westerners who accessed indigenous and local knowledges, extracted that knowledge, and then presented it as their own expert knowledge. And systems of co-production, even if they are set up to be, they're meant to be positive and equitable, sometimes they can replicate these same patterns if you're not constantly sort of reiterating and revising such approaches. And as Marley says, if it's not, long-term sort of equitable, trustful relationships that are being built there, so you can have the sort of best will in the world, but you can replicate those knowledge hierarchies just as a result of the actions that you're taking. Sorry, Rembrandt, please.
Yeah, in context of access, I also feel that you can turn it around. Like, most people do not understand the sea at all. I mean, I live in the Netherlands. We have a coastline of half the country is very close to the sea. If you talk to people that literally live a couple of miles away from the sea, they have no relation. They have no clue, sort of, so to speak. I mean, I'm exaggerating and simplifying. So there's also this question of access, of how to experience the sea, how to understand the sea and the creatures in the sea. So one of the sessions in this week of beautiful sessions was somebody at the Azores had made, that was this morning, I think, had made recordings of sounds of whales and dolphins, and then did this research with the community of some of the Azores islands. And then the artists, the musicians, started to experiment with these sounds. And in the end, there was a kind of a festival, of a kind of a project where it was presented to the people, other people. And so one of the things she said, but it's in my words, is that this exercise, because it was not like cognitive information, but it was a different kind of relation, created a connection, created kind of an access that wasn't there before. So I was really enthusiastic about it, because it sort of turned around the notion of access to the creatures or the sea from the start. And so what I find very irritating and unacceptable is that the beautiful project that you're talking about, Marley, or also the examples that you mentioned, that there is so little movement or so little interest from, let's say, classical researchers or classical scientists or whatever, to go to the quote unquote indigenous people. And that's the wrong way of putting it, but I find that mind-boggling, that we are not using that kind of access, that we don't using that kind of understanding or that close relationship. I don't get that. But anyway, that's more a comment than a question.
I know, thank you very much. I think it's a really important comment to make. Thank you. I'm just very wary of time, because we're now actually hitting the half-past mark. So I think I should probably bring the panel to an end. But thank you so much to all our panelists, and to everyone for asking questions and for keeping the discussion going. We were going to go into breakout groups, but we didn't have time. But in the breakout groups, I was just going to ask everyone to reflect on thinking about what knowledge hierarchies exist in your work. How do they manifest themselves? What challenges do you face in addressing and working through these? And also just thinking about what is the long-term and short-term impact of maintaining such knowledge hierarchies as well. So maybe I can leave you with those reflections rather than breakouts, and you can maybe email them or something. But yeah, I want to just thank everyone for coming along, and yeah, it's been such an interesting discussion, and thank you to all our presenters as well. So if we just a quick clap for everyone. That's good. There we go. Some people on screen clapping. Amazing. Thank you. And yeah, have good evenings, good days, wherever you are. And nice to meet you all.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Lovely
Thank
session.
you. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.